Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Staff Development for Educators, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for Project-Based Learning. Learn it, live it, love it with Lori Elliott. Before we start, there are a few things you should know. To allow for Lori to be heard clearly, attendee microphones are muted. We invite you to use the questions text box on your screen throughout the webinar to submit questions for our Q&A period at the end. Any audio or video problems you might experience during the presentation can usually be solved by closing any other programs or applications you may have open on your computer. This session is being recorded, and you should receive a link to the archive within 48 hours. And finally, at the end of today's presentation, you will see a short survey. By completing this survey, you will assist us in providing future complimentary webinars. For those who might not know us, Staff Development for Educators provides professional development for pre-K to 12 educators through on-site PD, PD events, and web-based PD. We empower educators with research-based, innovative, and rigorous PD that's practical, motivating, and fun. We are pleased to have Lori Elliott joining us today. Dr. Lori Elliott has been an educator for more than 25 years. She has served as a classroom teacher, technology integration specialist, and literacy coordinator, and is a former National Board Certified teacher. She currently works as an educational consultant and presenter. Lori is passionate about literacy, technology integration, and authentic learning. She believes building positive relationships with students, parents, and colleagues is the most important thing we can do as educators. Her energy and love for teaching and learning is contagious. She is the author of Teach Like a Techie series books and Project-Based Learning for Real Kids and Real Teachers. Let's get started. At this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Lori.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited for you to be here this afternoon and spend a few minutes talking about one of my absolute favorite things, and that is project-based learning. As we get started, let's do a couple really quick logistical things, and then we'll dive into the content that we want to cover today. On the screen, you're going to notice that I did prepare a handout for folks that are joining us today or might be watching in the review in a little bit. And so I wanted you to have that. Feel free to write that down, take a picture of it. But I did put together some key ideas that we're going to cover today in the webinar in a PDF format so that you would have that as a resource. So please take advantage of that, and we can also put that in the comments section as we go through. The second thing I wanted to do is I did want to go over our agenda for this time this afternoon, because project-based learning is obviously a very large topic. And so I wanted to break it down to what this particular webinar is really going to focus on. And the first thing that we're going to focus on is what is true project-based learning, what it is, what it's not, and how it compares to just a project, because we like to keep kids busy. What's the difference? And then secondly, we're going to be talking about, once we understand what it really looks like, how do you prepare your students for it? Is this something you can just wing very early in the school year, or are there some steps that we need to take? We're going to talk about preparation for project-based learning. And finally, in the last couple of moments, I'm going to give you a couple of tips in terms of just getting started. How do I plan for project-based learning? What does that look like? And we'll just kind of make our conversation work within those three goals for our time today. So if we think about project-based learning, one of the things that I know is that it's quite the buzzword these days. It seems like that you're noticing more online, people talking about it, schools are implementing initiatives that are project-based, etc. And when I think about that in terms of my personal life, I think about all of the projects that I'm involved with, and they kind of, for me, typically fall within a couple of categories. I'm always planning for things. Maybe it's a trip or an event. I'm always organizing things and doing research to, organize and to plan, as well as to create things. And so our lives as teachers are filled with projects that are authentic and real, and they must happen. And we learn along the way as we do those. Well, when we think about this buzzword of project-based learning, I would say that we want to think about in terms of how we live with projects in our everyday life and how we can mirror that in the classroom, because we want students to have that same authentic task and challenge that we feel as adults as we're facing some things that we're planning, creating, and doing. And so when we think about project-based learning in those terms, I want us to be taking the next couple of minutes, and I'd like for us to really focus on what is the difference between just a project and project-based learning. And I think that the best way to kind of, to give illustration to this is to show you some examples. So I'm going to show you a few examples of what I believe to be true project-based learning units from various grade levels and various years throughout my career of working with students. And what I would really like for you to focus on as we're looking at just a couple of photos here in the next couple of minutes are what are the commonalities that you notice about all of these examples, that they all seem to have some things that are in common, and what does that speak to us in terms of what true project-based learning must be. So I'm going to begin with a very, very simple project. This one, as you can tell, are with younger learners. We're talking about first graders and kindergartners being the audience for this, and first graders taking on this task. So this is a very simple project that dealt with the students getting to know the people that worked at the school. We call it Get the Scoop on the School. And it's a really simple way to introduce kids to some standards about questioning and reading and writing and communication skills. And so this particular project dealt with the students really taking a tour of the school, recognizing the people that worked there, and then coming back together and saying, hey, we still don't really know what each of these wonderful people do in our building, and how do they help us as students? And so then the students, they paired off into small groups, and we worked with them to help them to understand how to ask questions and become interviewers. And essentially what these particular students did is they interviewed the people in the school, and then they chose a way that they could teach that to other students in the building, in this case being kindergartners. Now, I've done this kind of project multiple times with my students, and we always choose the most authentic audience that we can come across. Who can we help educate about the people that do this incredible work in our schools? And that helps our students to learn literacy skills and communication skills, but then they also are teaching that to another group of students, and they learn from the process as well. Let's look at another example. This example is about building the future community for the town that you live in. So one of the things that I noticed several years ago in my social studies curriculum, my students were asked to not only recognize who are the people in our community, how does our community work, but they were also supposed to begin to kind of take information about our community and make predictions about what would that look like down the road. And so this particular picture is a picture of after the students had researched and surveyed and found out about our own community, they decided what things would be needed because of the population that lived in our town, and they began to create this model of what our town would look like in a few years, or should look like in a few years, based on those needs. After these things were completed, we invited our community members to come and see our model towns, and also, kind of give feedback to what they saw. And so it was a great way for students to do research and social studies work, but then also share that with our community and get their feedback as well. This third example is a project that I've done many times, and I bet you have too, but I think with just a few little things we can make it a true project-based learning unit. This is basically a night at the museum type of project, and I've done this over the years multiple times for various reasons. Sometimes I have incorporated my science standards, such as when we're studying fossils and artifacts and earth science and rocks and things like that, along with my social studies, which talks about earlier civilizations, Native Americans perhaps, or even pioneers for where I live here in the Midwest. This is an illustration, a picture here of a group of second graders who were involved in this same project. And they began to study the people groups that lived in their town years ago. And they didn't stop there. They created artifacts, but they didn't stop there. They actually put their exhibits, their museum exhibits, in a local museum in a small town where they lived. And again, community members came and viewed that and began to see the history from the idea and the perspective of the second graders based on the research that they had done. So the artifacts really came alive. It was, really authentic to where they lived, but then also inviting the people who really would care about that, their own community members came and took part in that. So that's an illustration of this one. I have just a couple more that I want to share that I think really speak to our conversation today. This is another example of a project-based learning unit. Many of us have been involved in design challenges, and this is a design challenge that was given to a group of students to basically design what they could do with an empty building in a school district. They had a building that was no longer in use, and so they asked the students if they could come up with a plan. How could this building be used? And again, that dealt with social studies and science, but it also dealt with math because the students had to survey people, find out then based on what the survey said of how the building should be used, then they had to figure out how to design that. And they did measurement as they made the designs for that particular building and parking lot, etc. And then once the students did all that heavy lifting and that research and they made their models and their designs and etc., then they shared that first with their administrator in the building, and then that went on to be shared with their school board from the perspective of the students. So very powerful stuff when you have students input in how things should be different based on the research that they have done. And finally, this is a great example of many schools that are doing some really awesome things with gardening. And so to meet math and science standards, many schools are opting to develop herb gardens or full-fledged, greenhouses. And some have gone as far as, colleagues, friends of mine, they have set up an actual farmer's market. So the students learn and they grow all these wonderful crops, and then they share them with food banks as well as selling the produce that they have grown in an actual farmer's market so that someone can really benefit from the learning and the hard work that the students have done. So when I'm looking at each one of these, and you as well, and that quick run through, you're probably thinking, wow, those are kind of more extensive than, let's say, just building a diorama or doing a poster. And I want to say right off the top that all of those things are fantastic. And the very first example that we looked at with the girls that had interviewed the folks around their district, man, their projects were not splashy. They were posters and they were some simple writing and they had made some simple presentations through PowerPoint. They really didn't cost much. They weren't elaborate. Project-based learning doesn't have to be costly, but it does have to be powerful. And I hope that as we were looking through those examples, you would note that, wow, that's different than giving them a set of requirements, having them go home for 2 weeks and work on it, and then bringing it back. When we're really talking about project-based learning, we're talking about authentic tasks in which students really become the owners of that. And here are some of the key elements that really need to be part of that project-based learning experience if we're going to distinguish it between another activity, a STEM activity, or just a project. Which again, all of those are awesome. There's a time and a place for all of that type of instruction, but here are the key elements for the examples that we showed today. The first thing that I hope that you picked up on in my quick description is that each of those were based on standards. If we're really going to do project-based learning, I'm going to be honest, it's not about what would be fun or what would be cute. Although I'm going to tell you, those things typically happen, but that's not where we start. We start with what we have to teach, because in every one of those examples, either myself or the teachers I was working with, we had some standards we had to teach. And so we began to look at our curriculum through the eyes of what's the most authentic way for students to learn this. And not everything is taught through project-based learning, but those very important standards or groups of standards that are really so important, they're non-negotiable. We look at those and say, how can we make that real for students and give them the opportunity to do something with those that they will really comprehend at a deeper level. So they're all standards based. The second thing is all project-based learning units have an essential question. Some people call this a driving question. Some people call this, the overarching idea or question, the big idea. But essentially what this is this is the focus, that it is worded in such a way that students know exactly where they're headed and they know exactly how to get there. And it might be that your essential question is, how can we open a successful business? That's very simple, but yet kids know we're going to open a business. We want it to do well, so we have to learn learn everything we can to make that happen. Essential questions keep us from what I call chasing rabbits. In other words, essential questions help me to know this is what I've got, the standards, and I know I want this real world challenge for kids, but here's the essential question that will keep us in the guardrails, if you will, during this project. The third thing that I hope that you notice from my examples is that every single one of those project-based learning units were real world and authentic. Now, some of them started with a challenge, some of them dealt with a problem, some of them just had a task, or even a simulation sometimes can be the kind of challenge that we're going to look at. But in all of those, it's real world to the student, that they can get their hands dirty, if you will, that this is something that's important to first graders to know who works in their building and how do I teach the kindergartners about it. This is important to the group of students who are designing because they felt like, wow, they want to hear my voice on this. So that was a real problem. The school board was going to have to do something with the building. They just got to have their voice heard in the process. Also would make note here that real world learning is different for each grade level. What really appeals to a kindergartner is going to be very different than your fifth grader that you're working with. So we want to be in tune to what is authentic for kids, but it definitely has to be the key essential part of the project-based learning unit. The next thing that you will notice is that each of those projects that we looked at had a launch. Now, I didn't describe every one of those, but I can tell you that in every one of the project-based learning units that I've done, it started with something engaging that got kids excited about this topic, this content, the problem, the challenge, etc. So sometimes that's a field trip. Sometimes it's a current event. Sometimes it is, pictures and videos, a guest speaker, but something has to really resonate with kids that say, wow, I want to know more about that. I want to understand how that works. So we work really hard in our project-based learning units to make sure that the project launch really hooks my kids and gets them excited about it. The fifth thing that I hope that you noticed as we were going through those examples would be students and the work of the student. You see, we're so used to in teaching that we do all the work. We decide what we're going to teach and what they're going to learn and how they're going to learn it, and really step by step by step. And we are so awesome now about modeling and scaffolding, and we're going to still do those things. But in project-based learning, we begin to hand over that learning to students. And students actually do the questioning, the research, creating, and sharing. We're there to guide, and we do many lessons, and we model for them. But once we have established where we're headed and the tools that we're going to be using, then we let kids take ownership and let them give us ideas and feedback. And to me, that's been the power of project-based learning. On with that, continuing with the elements, the sixth thing that you will notice is that there's ongoing assessment. Some of you today are viewing and you're concerned, maybe your school's going this direction, and wow, Lori, how do you assess that? And you've got all these kids and they're doing different things. I want you to feel comfortable knowing that the assessment starts from the beginning of the unit all the way through. It's not just one grade based on just a rubric. That might be a piece of it, but there's going to be checkpoints and quizzes and tests and journaling and all kinds of things along the way, as well as that final product scoring guide or rubric and final summative assessment. Man, when I get done with the project-based learning unit, I've got tons of grades to really see for each individual student, not only how they're doing with the project, but how are they really learning that content and to what level. And that's the really great thing that is important about this. The seventh element here that for some of you, you might have noticed in every one of the examples, there was always a real audience for the work. And for many teachers that I work with, this is the moment that they say, oh my goodness, I get it, right? I've done projects, but I didn't ever have a true real audience. We did things, we all celebrated in the classroom, and it was over. When you go to the next level, even some of the projects you're already doing, you can make them project-based learning by just making them more of a real-world connection. How do you bring in an audience? And that audience doesn't always have to be the community. It could be other people, it could be parents, it could be younger students, it could be experts from a university, or it could be posting things online. But I want to tell you that that real public audience fuels the motivation for kids. That as I'm working with them, one of the things they love about project-based learning is somebody cares about the work that they're doing. So when teachers are planning and they ask me, my goodness, Lori, what do I do about that? You know, how do I pick an audience where it doesn't have mom and dad coming in every, few weeks? I always say to those teachers, and I'd say to you, who will care about the work that you're doing? Really, is it an engineer that would care? Really, is it a business person or a community member, or is it mom and dad? That should be your audience. And let's just kind of wind these elements up. Number 8 is about teacher scaffolding and conferencing. You see, one of the things we want to know is this is not a free-for-all. This is not just a bunch of, you give kids a bunch of stuff and they're just crazy for 3 weeks and you hope it works out in the end. That in every project that you saw, that was very much orchestrated by the teacher, not telling them what to do all along the way, but the guidance, the scaffolding that was there, the questioning that was there, allowed for students to not only own the learning, but be successful. And one of the keys here that I talk so much about when I do my workshop is the conferencing piece, the conferring piece. That when I first started doing project-based learning, I would, kind of run around the room and check on kids, and I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. But oftentimes, trouble spots, I missed them because I wasn't having the formal conversations with them to really check in on specifics. When I began to change that and change the kind of conversations we were having, wow, the quality of work and everything that was taking place really went to the next level. And finally, reflection. Reflection doesn't just mean assessment, but it does mean not only looking at the content and did we learn the standards that we set out to learn, but also how do we feel in terms of working together, our input, our part of the project, how did we do personally? And so a lot of reflection on the part of the student and the teacher. So honestly, the elements here, hopefully you saw them illustrated in the examples. This is the theory, right? So these are the theory, the philosophy and the theory behind what makes project-based learning different than a project. And I hope for you that right now some of those things are resonating with you. Okay, this is distinguishing between, again, this great little activity that I do for a class period compared to this. But I want you to know that project-based learning can look really different, that I tried to show you everything from very simple to some things that are a little bit more complex. The thing that a lot of teachers ask me about is, how does this differ from, let's say, thematic units? And I'm going to tell you there is a difference. There's several differences, but I love thematic units, and I do believe they have a place. So I really believe that thematic units are great to cushion between various project-based learning units that you do throughout the year. And so when I think about things, like the apple units and the penguin units, I would never tell teachers, let's not do those things. But if you really wanted to take a look at are they project-based learning? And I would say a lot of times they're not, but you could change them to be that way. On this particular slide, I think you can see the differences between the two, that all of the elements that we have discussed make project-based learning very real world, student centered. They do the work, they decide what products, they have a real audience for learning. And our thematic units, which are important, they're really teacher directed. We decide the theme, we decide the activities. It doesn't really tie together other than through the theme. There's not a driving question or a real world challenge, and we really don't have an audience for the learning. But what does happen is engagement and excitement about learning happens in the thematic unit. But I'd also like to share that if you wanted to take a thematic unit and turn it to project-based learning, it would be easy to tweak. So when we think about the penguin unit that we had illustrated just a second ago, instead of just doing lots of random penguin activities, and the kids love that, how about taking it to the next level and really challenging them to find out why certain penguin groups are really kind of becoming not quite extinct, but they're dying off? What is going on in, with their habitat that's causing certain penguin groups, to have those kinds of issues, and what can we do to help them to survive? Wow, we've just taken something really high interest, very thematic, but we've made it very much an authentic problem. And now kids have something that they could really, grab hold of and really do some research about. So when we think about that, again, our first goal is to understand what project-based learning is and what it's not. And I hope we've kind of clarified that, along with making it very clear everything's important. Projects, project-based learning, thematic units, they all have their place. And so when teachers say, oh my goodness, I don't know where to start, I want to really highly encourage you, before you get all excited about planting your garden or interviewing people in your building or doing a food truck business with your kiddos or whatever you're thinking now, like, wow, we could do this. That would be so real for our students to learn this math or science or social studies or language arts. Hold on. I'm going to give you some tips. The first thing that I say for teachers is, let's see where your kids are. Are they ready for project-based learning? And here's what I call PBL prep. I think it's critically important that before we jump into something like project-based learning, these are the steps that I would want students to go through, and that would tell me, okay, we're ready to roll into something like that. Do we have a strong community? Have we built a community where kids will take risks? They know how to work independently and with others. Have they done cooperative learning? Have they done inquiry, STEM activities where there wasn't just a one right word answer or one answer, but they were willing to, they learned the stamina to wrestle with something for a little while? That's really important prior to doing project-based learning. Along with that, I would give them small research tasks that they need to accomplish before they get to project-based learning. That so much of what they have to do is digging in, and if they've never done any of that, that's really going to bog down the unit. So we want to teach them some research skills, not everything, but just enough that they would understand how to do some basic research. Technology. If you want in your unit for kids to do Google Forms for surveys and things like that, then prior to the project-based learning unit, prep them by doing some small activities that teach them how to do that. And finally, I put stations and centers, but really what I'm talking about here is movement. Have they been allowed to move from thing to thing and work with other people and understand, how to wait for conferencing and chatting with the teacher? All of these prep ideas are great for just grade instruction, no matter what approach that you have. But I think they're critically important that I have these things in place before I start my first project-based learning unit, even though they're going to learn within the unit all kinds of new standards and getting along with people and things. But some of those things I want to really be proactive with, intentional with prior to getting into the unit, because we're going to have so much heavy lifting to do in the unit. This is going to ease the load, if you will, if I do some of these things before we get to that point. And so finally, my tips then, one would be to prep your kids for it, and then talk about the planning. If you're intrigued and you're like, I don't know where to go now, first of all, we want to talk about the planning. And then secondly, we want to talk about the implementation of that. But for me, how I plan is I start with standards. What do I have to teach? And what are 4 to 6 really great standards, either from one content area or multiple content areas that are so heavy in our curriculum, this would be worth our time to really think about a project-based learning unit. Secondly, what's a real-world application? In other words, what will your task, challenge, simulation be? How are you going to make this authentic for kids? And so the way that I think about that is, here's my standards. Who in the real world does these things? What does it look like when they're really, up and running in the real world? Do engineers do it? Do designers do it? Musicians? Who's doing those things? And then I begin to construct this challenge or idea of, wow, this could be what I give the kids as a challenge, and this is how they will learn those standards. The third thing that I would say, as you're thinking about planning for project-based learning, what resources and experts do you already have around you? What things are in your library, your community, who's in your building, or parents that know something about what you're getting ready to study, people you can reach out to online. Always, before we jump into a unit, I want to know, what do I have available to me, and who can I reach out to that can help us with this? And fourth, then, Once you have those in mind, then you can begin to write your essential question, and that driving question about what do you really want to have the students accomplish during this time. And then the final planning step I take is the assessment timeline. I know we don't like talking about assessment, but I told you it needs to be robust in order for our kids to really do well. So one of the things that I keep in mind there is a timeline. I think through where will be the checkpoints where I'll check on this content that these students are supposed to learn, and what will be the deadlines for completing the project-based learning unit. Once I have all of those things, in mind and sorted out, then we begin to start our project-based learning unit. And units last anywhere from a couple of weeks to some schools do, quarter long projects. It really just depends. Some people do year-long projects. It just depends on your goals, and it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. In another webinar, hopefully, I'll get a chance to share my personal step-by-step, because I think that the implementation of all the things we've talked about is what's key and important. And I really do have it down to a manageable, almost formula of how do you take all this planning and make it really true for your students. So hopefully we'll get a chance to visit about that in the future. I'm talking about project-based learning, the next steps in actuality, putting it into implementation from the day you launch it with the kids to the very end when you reflect with them. So when we think about project-based learning, I hope that you've gotten a little bit of insight into what it is. I hope that you understand, a little bit about the prep that it takes to get your kids there, and then the exciting part of planning, and then really begin to implement that in your classroom. Some folks have, been asking about, I want to know more. I want those 9 steps about, how do you actually make it work? So I am going to be around and doing several project-based learning workshops, which we will elaborate on everything we chatted about here and more. And so with each of those upcoming trainings we're going to do, we're actually you get my free book with your registration. So I'm really excited about that, because I think that's going to be a great resource as we work together through this topic. Just so you know, I'll be in Baton Rouge in a couple of weeks in November. And then following that, I'm going to also be in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Also here in October, I'm going to be in Houston, Texas. But if you check SDE.com, you're going to find all kinds of opportunities from now through the winter months where I'm going to be with teachers and sharing these ideas. And again, we have more time to elaborate on the concepts. So thank you for joining me today. I hope it's piqued your curiosity a little bit, and we look forward to hearing back from you, and as well as hopefully seeing you at one of the workshops so I can answer more of your questions. Back to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. We'll take a few minutes to give attendees one last chance to submit questions, but in the meantime, to thank everyone for being with us today, we'd like to offer you a 10% discount off SDE professional development events or on-site training by using the promo code WebBrief before November 9th, 2018. You might be interested in saving 10% and joining Lori at one of her upcoming events that she just spoke about. Plus, you can save the dates for SDE's 2019 National Conference in Las Vegas, which is July 8th through the 12th. There, you'll join thousands of other educators with hundreds of expert presenters in one of the largest PD events for educators. It's an experience you won't forget. Full details and 15% early bird limited time savings on registration are available at sde.com/national. Use promo code EB19WB. Of course, if you can't make it to a seminar or conference, SDE is ready to provide customized on-site or web-based training that meets your school or district's unique needs. For more information about PD events or training, call 877-388-2054, or you can visit sde.com. So let's go ahead and start. There are a couple of questions that came in. Lori, one question that came in is PBL just an addition to regular classroom instruction, or does it take the place of traditional teaching?
Oh, that's fantastic. It actually takes the place of traditional teaching. So when we are looking at those standards that we want to address, instead of teaching them then doing this unit, that is how you teach those standards. So that's an excellent question. Nobody has time to teach everything we're supposed to teach and then do this on top of it to duplicate. This is when you choose your standards for a certain time and this particular unit, and that is how you teach those standards. So this would be definitely a replacement, not an addition to what you're already doing.
Thank you for that. And then Anne asked if you could reshare the bit.ly link from the beginning of your presentation.
Yes, I will. Let me grab that while we're chatting. I can put that up right now. There you go, guys.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just give everyone a second to look at that screen. And that was pretty much it that came in for questions for today. So please remember the archive of this presentation should be available within 48 hours, and live attendees will receive a follow-up email that will include a link to the archive recording. Our thanks to Lori for joining us today. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation and that you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.